So, Overly Sarcastic Productions is one of the history channels on YouTube. They cover a wide variety of historical topics and subjects, but the one I'll be focusing on is their most viewed video yet. Their coverage on H.P. Lovecraft, and why it kind of stinks. Now, why is it bad? Because, it must be good if it has that much views. And the key points are 1. Oversimplifying and misrepresenting Lovecraft. 2. Misrepresenting the core elements of his tales, i.e., cosmicism. 3. Not covering important subjects in Lovecraft's works. 4. Why is cool air here and the odd treatment of the color out of space. And 5. Not citing any scholars or primary sources. But let me elaborate.
What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine?
Let's first start with the first point. Oversimplifying and misrepresenting Lovecraft.
All themes that manage to make perfect sense when contextualized with Lovecraft's life story, which was pretty much a depressing downward spiral from minute one. Lovecraft was born in 1890 to one of those well-off New England families that still thought of themselves as proper English semi-nobility, an image that became harder and harder to maintain due to their perpetual state of financial decline. Lovecraft was intermittently schooled but never really finished his education, and had access to a decent library with pretty nifty scientific texts, but had too delicate of a constitution for math, and as such made no progress beyond the basics in any of his fields of scientific study, which explains his thorough misunderstanding of non-Euclidean geometry, non-visible light, and the concept of an air conditioner. His mother was institutionalized in 1918, but unfortunately we have no idea what was actually wrong with her because the medicine of the time had a tendency to exclusively diagnose women with hysteria, aka being a woman disease. When she died in 1921, Lovecraft took it really hard, got severely depressed, and started writing The Call of Cthulhu, one of the first stories that brought themes of existential horror into his developing mythos. Lovecraft's lack of marketable skills stopped being much of a problem for him when he married a breadwinner businesswoman in 1924, and moved into his wife's apartment in Brooklyn, which he hated more than anything, in large part because New York is one of those places where immigrants happen. Oh yeah, the racism. So Lovecraft's proper New England breeding was a major source of pride for him, and basically all of his stories have seriously classist and racist themes, with his heroes being well-educated white dudes with no phonetically transcribed accents, and his villains being literally everybody else. This being good old English racism, he cared less about skin color directly and more about breeding overall, so there's a number of white people bad guys too, albeit uneducated, inbred, and poor, but it's no accident a lot of his horror is derived from people crossbreeding with other races. Part of this might have been Lovecraft's clear and obvious discomfort and disinterest with all things sexual, but there's also a bunch of racism wrapped up in there. Lovecraft eventually got overwhelmed by the horror of the outside world and moved back home to Providence, lived on a dwindling inheritance for the rest of his life, and died almost completely unknown from intestinal cancer at age 46.
Alright, we'll start with this clip right here and why it's completely false.
Lovecraft was intermittently schooled but never really finished his education, and had access to a decent library with pretty nifty scientific texts, but had too delicate of a constitution for math, and as such made no progress beyond the basics in any of his fields of scientific study.
Well, we're off to a good start. So, this clip made it seem like that Lovecraft had a poor understanding in mathematics and science, and that's why he failed high school, or dropped out of high school, and most of his education was self-taught, or he had tutors or something. What bugs me is that this is completely not true. Alright, so it's partially true. Yes, Lovecraft did struggle in algebra, and yes, he did drop out of high school, but not for the reasons that OSP would allude. Okay, I'll explain why. According to I Am Providence, The Life and Times of H.P. Lovecraft, written and edited by S.T. Joshi, Lovecraft was very proficient in high school. Like, he had very good grades in chemistry, geography, astronomy, meteorology, and was an acclaimed Latinist, poet, and weird fiction writer. Okay, fiction writer. He was a weird fiction writer until he was an adult. But you see my point. And he has the grades to show it. And this is where I pause to explain S.T. Joshi and why his words hold a lot of weight. So, S.T. Joshi is an American literary critic and scholar who specializes in weird pulp fiction, specifically H.P. Lovecraft. And he isn't just any other scholar. No, no, no. He is the head authoritative scholar in Lovecraft studies. Yes, that's an actual thing. And one might say he's the Pope of Lovecraft. And that is why I cite him. In fact, you will see his name a lot in this video. Considering he knows more Lovecraft than any of us, including me. But back to Lovecraft. So, knowing this, how and why did Lovecraft drop out of high school? He was described as a transatlantic Oxford Don, and he seemed to have a very bright future in academia. So, what changed? Well, the answer is simple. It's the same reason why Clark Ashton Smith dropped out. The answer was his declining mental health. So, in 1908, he suffered from a full-fledged nervous breakdown. We don't know what exactly this breakdown was, but according to Lovecraft himself, he described it as intense headaches, insomnia, and general weakness. Now you might think, oh, that's quite bad, but how is this like high school dropout levels of bad? Well, here's how one of his classmates described it. She described these terrible tics he had. He'd be sitting in his seats and suddenly up and jump. I think referred to them as seizures. The family took him out of high school, and then whatever education he presumably got was from private tutors, whatever that meant. Oh yes, she remembered him. I guess he scared the student body half to death. This is also taken from I Am Providence, by the way. And yeah, you can see why Lovecraft dropped out. Overall, Lovecraft was clearly not some dumb high school dropout, as this clip might make it out to be. Well, yes, he was a dropout, but he certainly was not an idiot. Alright, but what about the rest of this simplified timeline? Well, they rather omitted a lot of key important context when understanding Lovecraft's life and character, such as they never mentioned his grandpa. So, okay, why is his grandpa so significant? Well, it's because that his death was directly linked to his family's financial decline. And it's also a large part as to why Lovecraft didn't finish high school. He was that stricken with grief, actually. And now, at least they did mention his mom, who was a very important figure in his life. But they cut out some very important context about his mom. You see, just like Robert E. Howard, Lovecraft had a very unusual relationship with his mother. And unlike Robert E. Howard, his relationship with her is toxic and some would say abusive. Yeah, there was a reason why she was institutionalized instead of going cuckoo crazy. I mean, this is how one of Lovecraft's neighbors, Clara Heiss, recalled her encounter with his mom. My call was pleasant enough, but the house had struggled a shut-in air and the atmosphere seemed weird, and Mrs. Lovecraft talked continuously of her unfortunate son, that he hid from everyone and did not like to walk upon the street where everyone could gaze. Yeah, calling your son hideous is something no mother should do, and all this treatments Lovecraft faced possibly led to the creation of the short story The Outsider. And he once told his wife, Sonia, that her attitudes towards him was, in his words, devastating. Oh yeah, speaking about Sonia Green, why didn't you mention her by name? You just say, businesswoman. What, so she's just not important to you? Her name is Sonia Green. Like, she's rather important. And the reason why they separated was rather complex and more complicated than just Lovecraft being racist. Well, that was one reason, but there were more reasons than that. And I don't really like how Sonia is just pushed back into sidelines despite, being rather important when it comes to understanding Lovecraft. But anyway, is it really that hard to just say this? Lovecraft was born to those well-off New English families, whose wealth started to decline sharply after the death of his grandpa in 1904. This deeply affected Lovecraft, as he never finished high school due to this, and also in tandem with his declining mental health, ultimately causing him to drop out despite having relatively good grades, aside from algebra. In 1908, shortly after Lovecraft dropped out, he and his mom moved to an apartment complex where he suffered from harsh verbal abuse from her. Then in 1918, his mother was finally institutionalized. In 1921, his mother would die from a gallbladder operation, leading to Lovecraft at first feeling devastated, but then grew to have a feeling of liberation given how toxic his relationship with her was, and how his health seemed to have suddenly and suspiciously improved without her presence. He would then go on and marry Sonia Green in 1924 and move to New York, which he hated because of immigrants. Oh yeah, he was racist! And due to financial reasons caused by the Great Depression, he and Sonia would separate in 1926, where he proceeded to move back to Providence and stayed there until his death in 1937 with small intestinal cancer, making a small living writing for pulp magazine companies and editing and writing other pulp authors. And along the way, he met, befriended, ghostwrote, and even mentored some other pulp authors, like Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, Clark Ashton Smith, the creator of the Hyperborean Cycle, Robert Bloch, who would later become the author of the psychological horror novel Psycho, C.L. Moore, the creator of Gyro of Joyery, and Harry Houdini? See, was it that hard to make an actual good timeline with proper context? Now, next is the racism. Okay, this one will be brief, as this will be more elaborate on the second section. So, Joshi has argued before that although Lovecraft's views weren't extreme or unusual at the time, considering this was depicted in the covers of pulp mags, what was unusual was how his views were more pronounced than others, meaning he expressed his views more frequently than others. However, they are rather subtle compared to his contemporaries, which did not hold back any punches. But moving on, let's talk about his stories.
Of worldly things, he's great Cthulhu.
So, OSP in this clip claims that all of Lovecraft's tales contain racist elements and all villains in his tales are either racial minorities or low-breed whites, and made it seem like the core fundamental of his works is racism.
Oh yeah, the racism. So Lovecraft's proper New England breeding was a major source of pride for him, and basically all of his stories have seriously classist and racist themes, with his heroes being well-educated white dudes with no phonetically transcribed accents, and his villains being literally everybody else. This being good old English racism, he cared less about skin color directly and more about breeding overall, so there's a number of white people bad guys too, albeit uneducated, inbred, and poor, but it's no accident a lot of his horror is derived from people crossbreeding with other races. Part of this might have been Lovecraft's clear and obvious discomfort and disinterest with all things sexual, but there's also a bunch of racism wrapped up in there.
Now, yes, a handful of his tales do contain minority villains like the Shunned House, the Streets, Medusa's Coil, the Call of Cthulhu, and of course the horror at Red Hook. You can argue with the Shadow of Innsmouth and the facts concerning the late author German and his family count. Alright, so you might think that, well, there's quite a handful of tales. Well, yeah, there are only a handful of tales. Considering Lovecraft wrote 70 solo stories, 500 poems, and 35 collab or revision stories, making a total of 105 tales and 500 poems. And equally a handful of these tales lack racist elements. particularly The Curse of Yig, The Haunter of the Dark, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, The Shadow Out of Time, etc., etc. Oh, and in particular, the short story He, which, according to St. Joshi, reading of this story shows it to be anti-racist. For all Lovecraft's lamentations about contemporary environment of New York, the story is a straightforward supernatural revenge narrative in which the spirits of Native Americans, whom the English squire had poisoned and whose land he subsequently claimed for his own, dispatched that preternaturally aged gentleman in a particular pungent manner, and the narrative tone of the story suggests that the Englishman got his just desserts. And it's not mentioning how, in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, the main villain is a tall, pallid, rich, blonde dude named Joseph Kerwin, who is arguably Lovecraft's most evil villain. Because I Am Mason and George Rogers comes at a close second, and those two are also white. Alright, so not every story that Lovecraft wrote had a racist minority character. But what about the core foundation of Lovecraft stories? Is it classism and racism? No, it isn't. Again, with St. Joshi, here's what he said about the foundations and core of Lovecraft stories. And I also maintain if we do not know of Lovecraft's racial views, it would occur to very few of us to see a racist element in any but a small number of his tales. Even some of those that do know of his views have still come to that conclusion, as when the British philosopher John Gray wrote, "Fortunately, the core of Lovecraft's works has nothing to do with his social and racial resentments." What Joshi is saying is that he firmly confirms that the core of Lovecraft's works has nothing to do with his classism and racism. But you know what is the core of his stories? Cosmicism. You know, the literary philosophy that Lovecraft pioneered and developed. And speaking of cosmicism, let's look at this clip right here.
With the context of Lovecraft's overwhelming disgust and horror for everything he didn't understand, almost his entire body of work begins to make sense. The thing that makes Lovecraftian horror, and the thing that's kept it popular, is this overwhelming fear of the unknown, a concept that easily translates even as the unknown changes with social and scientific developments. Even though Lovecraft's works haven't aged well at all, the underlying principle is sound. If you don't fully understand something, you can interpolate existential horror and turn every mystery into a nightmare of things man was not meant to know. And separate from that, the aesthetic of horror he chose is also pretty effective on its own. Lovecraft's overwhelming fear of the ocean produced a memorable and viscerally nasty horror aesthetic grounded in slime and rot that was far removed from the cold stone sterility of the previous gothic horror genre. So, all that in mind, let's take a look at a few of the genre-defining short stories cranked out from Horrible Phobia's Lovecraft's darkest nightmares.
Well, we're not off to a good start. If his works didn't age well, then there wouldn't be an entire academic study solely focusing on his works and his life, and this video I'm responding to wouldn't even exist. But anyway, this clip alludes to the claim that Lovecraft wrote horror stories from stuff he didn't understand. A very bold claim, but I have one question. Where's your source? Are there any academic pieces, or at least a quote from a scholar, where you can point back to back up your claim? So here's my rebuttal, and unlike you, I provide a source. So, going back to I Am Providence, it reveals that most of Lovecraft's inspiration for writing horror came from Edgar Allan Poe and Arthur Machen, and his inspiration for creating the old ones was Lord Dunsany, the legend among legends. There are others, but these are the more significant ones. And nowhere in this biography states that Lovecraft wrote horror from stuff he doesn't understand. And I find it very off how you never covered or at least mentioned the philosophy of cosmicism and cosmic horror. I mean, technically you did, but it was just so brief I missed it. Which, just like the fear of the unknown, is a very important part in Lovecraft's works. In fact, Lovecraft has once said all of his tales are about cosmic horror. So, it's kind of odd how you completely omitted this core fundamental in Lovecraft's works. It's like talking about Robert E. Howard without talking about the nature of barbarism, and instead just talk about him being a rough and tough Texan. Okay, so for the OSP watchers who are watching this and going, Robert E. Who now? And Clark Ashton whatchamacallit, while you're typing death threats and trying to dox me, this moves on to my next point. Where the fuck is the Cthulhu mythos? Like, OSP briefly mentions the Lovecraft mythos, or the Cthulhu mythos as shown here.
Lovecraft is famous for codifying the Lovecraftian horror mythos, a cosmology he created with centralized themes of cosmic horror, ancient, unknowable, and malevolent gods, and everything smelling vaguely of fish.
So, why is this an issue? Because this is a very important part in literary history. It not only influences media to this very day, but also gives us very valuable insights as to who Lovecraft was as a person and how pulp magazines function. Not covering how the mythos works and how significant it is like covering MLK without discussing the civil rights movement. You see what I mean? Alright, so back during the golden age of pulp magazines were these cheap, inexpensive pieces of literature made by and for the working class. Now, because that pulp was cheap and inexpensive and contained rather vulgar and violent content, they were often viewed as lowbrow and low-quality literature, and the covers did not help at all. That being said, Lovecraft just so happened to publish all of his stories under these pulp mags. But despite the pulp's negative reputation, they had a profound impact on modern fantasy and sci-fi. This is where great minds and authors like Isaac Asimov and Robert Bloch began their writing career. This is where Robert E. Howard created Conan the Barbarian. This is where C.L. Moore broke the mold and created one of the first major female fantasy heroes. And this is where Lovecraft created his Cthulhu mythos. Now, all of the formerly mentioned authors I listed, aside from Asimov, they were all friends and acquaintances with Lovecraft. And now, the very cool part about pulp stories is that the authors did not care if other authors used their elements for their works. They did not care about copyright. And Lovecraft was no exception. In fact, he actively encouraged others to use his fiction, leading to stuff like elements from the Conan stories making their way into the Cthulhu mythos, and vice versa, as well as creatures like Sotogwa and Shinarfanung. Yeah, the Sotogwa and the Shinarfanung. These guys weren't created by Lovecraft. They were created by Clark Ashton Smith and Frank Belknap Long, respectively. Just like how Lovecraft would inspire his friends also did the same. And I guess this section debunks the myth that Lovecraft was an agoraphobic weirdo who was hypersensitive to criticism and hated everything outside of Providence, considering a lot of his friends did not come from Providence, and some of them were his critics like Henry Kuttner. Regardless, the Cthulhu mythos is a very important part in not only understanding Lovecraft, but also understanding how literature can evolve and change over time. And you can introduce your viewers to these very underrated but very talented writers like Clark Ashton Smith and C.L. Moore. Like, these guys are criminally underrated, but they're just so goddamn talented. So I wonder, why didn't OSP like cover or at least briefly explain the Cthulhu mythos, considering it's, that significant? Anyway, I can't figure out a good transition to the next one, so here's the next point.
Nobody even wants you here.
So, why is Cool Air here and not at the Mountains of Madness or the Shadow Out of Time or the Whisperer in Darkness? I mean, from this clip, they claim to cover the genre-defining stories of H.P. Lovecraft, in this clip right here.
So, all that in mind, let's take a look at a few of the genre-defining short stories cranked out from Horrible Phobias Lovecraft's Darkest Nightmares.
So, why is Cool Air here, considering that Cool Air was one of Lovecraft's more okay and some say forgettable stories? Now, if you would say, oh, she says short stories, while at the Mountains of Madness, Shadow Out of Time, and Whisper in Darkness are novellas. Okay, then cover The Rats in the Walls, or The Dreams in the Witch House, or The Haunt of the Dark. Basically, any other good short story besides Cool Air. And even then, they didn't even get the inspiration for the story right, as they allude that the reason why Lovecraft wrote Cool Air was because he was scared of air conditioning, as seen in this clip.
And as such, made no progress beyond the basics in any of his fields of scientific study, which explains his thorough misunderstanding of non-Euclidean geometry, non-visible light, and the concept of an air conditioner.
According to another Lovecraft scholar, David E. Schultz, Cool Air was based off of Lovecraft's sour stay in New York, and Lovecraft himself has confirmed that the story was based off of an Arthur Machen tale, the novel of White Powder. Actually, the novel of The White Powder. And you know what's funny? This was taken off of Wikipedia. So that means OSP didn't do their research properly, considering I can easily search this up in fucking Wikipedia. How the millions of views, people, millions of views. Oh, and one thing. Where do you get the source that Lovecraft wrote The Color Out of Space because he didn't understand the visible light spectrum? And that leads to my last point.
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the f up.
Yeah, this is the main issue here. Like, where are you getting all your claims from? Claims such as Lovecraft being afraid of everything, so he wrote horror tales from stuff he didn't understand. And the claim that the very core of Lovecraft's body of work is his classism and racism. Like, where are you getting this from? Is it from a biography, from a scholar, from any piece of academia? Or is it from a primary source like Lovecraft's letters or his friends' letters or statements made by his friends or wife? Like, anything? Where are the citations? Where are the sources? Because when I look up these, like, scholars and pieces of academia, they completely debunk your claims. Such as, the whole Lovecraft being scared of everything, and so he wrote stuff he didn't understand. When in reality, Lovecraft's main inspiration for writing horror was from his love of horror fiction and weird fiction, like Edgar Allan Poe, Arthur Machen, William Hope Hodgson, Algernon Blackwood, Robert W. Chambers, Lord Dunsany, and his friends, and also his love for astronomy and science like biology. And this was taken from I Am Providence Volumes 1 and 2. So I'll ask this question again. where are your citations and sources? From his stories? I mean, partially valid, but there's a reason why many fields of studies, I mean, all fields of studies, require you to cite an academic source or a primary source. And how the lead authoritative scholar in Lovecraft studies completely debunks your claim that the core fundamentals of Lovecraft is his racism. I don't know. It seems like you pull a lot of this shit out of your ass. And at the end of the day, Lovecraft is not his stories or characters. I mean, anyone can take Lovecraft's work and make some random bullshit claims about it. Like, for example, the notorious August Derleth, a friend and correspondent of Lovecraft who recontextualizes Lovecraft's works as a good versus evil fantasy thing and not a cosmic horror thing. Yeah, so I'll repeat again. That's the main issue. They never cite any academic or primary sources, and even their claims are ridiculous. Like their claim that Lovecraft wrote Cool Air because he was scared of air conditioning. Yeah, that sounds very crazy, but where's your source though? Like, do you have a letter Lovecraft wrote confirming it was because he was scared of air conditioning? Or do you have a scholar's consensus on the work? No? Okay. And then the claim that Lovecraft did not understand visible light spectrum. Cool, but again, where are you getting this from? Where's the source of these claims? Because if you do not provide a credible source, it makes it seem like you're pulling this shit out of your ass, and this is just August Derleth all over again. So, in conclusion, now you see why many Lovecraft fans find this video very poor. Their poor coverage of Lovecraft as a person, their poor coverage of his works and their fundamentals, and of course, not providing any sources or citations. Like, not even a dubious one, just absolutely zero. In fact, I'll make this very, very hot take. I believe that power scalers, yes, those Lovecraft power scalers that I just love so much, do a far better job at covering Lovecraft than OSP. Because, at least those assholes provide a source and a citation. Meanwhile, OSP does not. Like, at the end of their video, they provide no citations or sources, and when I check their description, well, no citations or sources. So, I honestly question, how do they get this much views, and how do people trust them this much? They have no sources or backing, they have no citations, and their research is very poor. So, how did... well, it's just a mystery that we will take to our graves then. Okay, oh, is this a source? Is this a source? The hell is this? Is this a source? Is this a source? Yeah, I don't think this is an academic source.